Welcome to the Grumpy Social Workers podcast with me, Soyeb
and me, Siobhan McLean. Here's your place for social work conversations that keep things real. So today, Soyeb, we're going to be talking about anti-oppressive practice. I mean, it's a huge area, a huge topic area. So there's potentially quite a bit here for us to get grumpy about. Now, I have particular grumps. I think you have some other grumps. I think actually we have quite different, although we agree with one another, I think our particular areas of feeling grumpy about this are perhaps quite different. So maybe that will come through in the conversation. But let me just ask you about your frustrations or thoughts or grumpiness around anti-oppressive practice. So over to you.
No, absolutely. I think Siobhan is such a huge area, isn't it? And when I was kind of thinking about the theme for this, I think linking it back to our previous session about social identity, I was thinking about how within the profession, we sometimes see elements or themes that we cover within AOP. So, you know, how we spoke about in the earlier podcast around NHS social workers not being recognised as real social workers that do statutory work, etc. And because of that, there's been times when I've not been allowed to attend, or previously was allowed to attend certain sessions or networks and stuff because I wasn't seen as a proper social worker. But yeah, there's elements of kind of that I've done a lot of work, or I do a lot of work with newly qualified social workers. And one of the things I do is I work with NQSWs from the global majority background. So we've got like a national network that they come to, and it's a space for them to come and talk about any issues facing them. And this was kind of set up because the statistics came out, as you know, Siobhan, in terms of NQSWs from the global majority background more likely to feel the ASYE. Now those statistics have changed, but some of the stories that the NQSWs were sharing with us from their experience of being a student on placement whilst being an NQSW was quite shocking in terms of they coming into a profession where we work to an anti-oppressive ethos and we have certain values and ethics, but these NQs and students were kind of talking about how they've been oppressed by other social workers or by organizations that we work in as well. So there's still that kind of element going on that we need to be kind of really conscious of. But I was smiling a little bit because I was thinking, you know, something, this is an area where I'm not going to be as grumpy because it's an issue that I've kind of worked with since I came into the profession. And I've been really lucky that I'm in networks and within projects which are looking at elements of inequality, you know, prejudice, discrimination, etc., and how we kind of address that. So I've been quite contained in terms of my grumpiness because I've got that space to be able to do that. But as soon as I said that, I thought to myself, oh no, that's not true, Shab. Come on. You're pretty much kicking off all the time and getting grumpy about all sorts around this. And we do, don't we? I think, you know, when I think about mental health, I'm often talking about the fact that we've still got services where if you're, for example, from the traveller community, you can't access services because you're not attached to a GP. If you don't speak English and you're trying to get a hold of the crisis team out of hours, you can't actually get through to them. Well, you can get through to them, but they're not going to understand what you're saying because, you know, most likely the person picking up the phone isn't bilingual. And the stuff I still hear around when I hear the phrase personality disorder, the comments that are made by professionals around that as well. So there's still a lot of kind of, I think, issues as well. And the statistics, you know, when I did my AMP training, I wrote about the fact that more young black males are more likely to get detained under the Mental Health Act, etc. And we're still seeing those statistics. And those things really kind of still frustrate me because I can't really understand why that is the case. So those are kind of areas I do get very grumpy about, I think, still as well. Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's more similarity than I was expecting in terms of our grumpiness because all of those things that you're saying there are all things that make me grumpy too. But you know, years and years ago when I was becoming a practice teacher, so we're talking about like 30 odd years ago, there was a document that was written by Setzwer, who were the old kind of, I suppose, equivalent of Social Work England now. And they brought together Black students to talk about their experience on placement. So it was a conference, and there was a paper from that conference called The Black Student's Voice. And I still remember reading that as a white practice educator and the learning that I got from that. And I always thought over the years, because that was from the 1990s, so over the years, I always thought, oh, there'll be someone, it must have been the early 90s, actually. I think it might have been 1991, 92, so very early. And I always thought somebody will do that again. And nobody ever did. So in 2020, I decided, because COVID came and I had a bit of time and stuff, I decided, look, try and pull something together. So I approached Wayne Reed from Basworth, and we brought together loads of narratives from social workers from global communities and called that Outlanders, hidden narratives from social workers of colour. And the oppression that those people writing in there, the contributors to that, the oppression that they talked about and experienced was massive. The amount of racism within our profession is terrifying, really, really terrifying. And I think we're not talking enough directly about anti-racist practice. So that's one of my grumpy things. But as you said, then lots of people are discriminated against within our profession. So I followed that up actually with a series of narratives from care experienced social workers called Insiders, Outsiders, because they have an inside of you, but are made to feel like outsiders. And then the most recent one was neurodivergent social workers. And I think, as you said, the statistics now on global majority newly qualified social workers on their ASYE is changing. But now we've got more neurodivergent newly qualified social workers are struggling with their ASYE. So I think there's so much oppression within this profession that is supposedly based on social justice and anti-oppressive practice. And it just makes me feel so grumpy, So we need to be addressing that, fundamentally need to be addressing that. And I think as white social workers need to, absolutely look in the mirror, look at what we're doing, really think about anti-racism much more broadly. I think that's so important. So there is such a lot of oppression within the profession, as you said.
I suppose the question, Siobhan, is why is that? It's really frustrating. I think I've asked that question to myself and to kind of groups that I've gone to talk to, or when this kind of subject kind of comes up, and we can't seem to answer it, because we're supposed to be a profession that advocates and works towards social justice and fights inequality. And in some scenarios, we're actually the instigators of that.
Yeah.
And it's just really frustrating. And when does it go back to that social identity bit and the roots of social work? And when I came into social work, the image of a social worker I used to see was, social workers out protesting with their kind of placards on the streets because they've seen something or they've heard something which they feel is injustice. And I don't see any of that at the moment. So I don't know if people are just scared of what they can and can't do, or whether it is that we're kind of drifting away from that kind of true, what I think is that kind of true social identity in terms of our values and ethics and things as well. So I'm not sure. I think it's really interesting. When I remember going to meet a group of social workers, Siobhan, who worked, and there were a couple of things I discussed with them, and one of things I kind of asked them was to say, how diverse is your workforce? And they said, very diverse. We've got very diverse workforce we've got social workers from different backgrounds and things. And then we started talking about the community they serve. And again, they said, yeah, it's a very diverse community. We started talking about what support they need in terms of training to look at things like equality, diversity, inclusion. And they said, we don't, because as we've said to you, we've got a very diverse workforce and we work in a very diverse community. And she was serious. I just didn't say anything. I was so shocked when I heard that. I just sat there and the meeting ended without us kind of coming up with any ideas, because I was just so taken back. I'd never heard that before. Because I think in those spaces, you need to be even more conscious of of anti-oppressive practice. And I can speak of that from my own example. In the previous podcast, I spoke about spirituality and stuff. And I remember when I first came into mental health, and I'd go and see a South Asian Muslim family, and they'd say to me, "Oh, Shab, our son's, hearing voices, and we think he's possessed by a jinn." And immediately I'd be like, "Right, okay, so we need you to support you to get spiritual support, etc." But the more I kind of worked in that setting, I realized that actually I need to understand the full extent of that, because I've spoke to the parents who are from a certain generation, and their perspective on mental health is from this perspective. But then when you speak to the siblings or the young person themselves, their perspective is completely different. So I remember going to see one family where it was that same scenario. Went to see somebody, she was hearing voices, she was quite young, and the parents and the grandparents were saying, yeah, it's because she's been possessed. And then uncle walked in, who was from a different generation, and the siblings walked in, that completely different generation, and they said it's nothing to do with that, it's because she's been bullied at school. So that perspective totally changed the narrative and approach to that. So it's kind of understanding those kind of perspectives as well when we're thinking about anti-oppressive practice.
Yeah, different views and different perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we go back to that question you raised about why is that, because I always love the why question, but I think it's really interesting. And again, I think this is something that we bring to this podcast is we've both been around for such a long time and had such varied careers. But, when I did my social work training in the 1980s, anti-racism was huge on the agenda, very significant on the agenda. And over time, what's happened is that's changed. It's become anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory practice. I think it's almost become a bit watered down and a bit, students will say to me, I was anti-oppressive there, or they'll write in an essay, I was anti-oppressive. And I'll go, great, tell me how. And they'll say something like, I actively listened to the person. And I think, really? Is that anti-oppressive? Just listening to somebody? Are we really being anti-oppressive there? And I think there's become a confusion within our training about what practice is non-oppressive, i.e. you're not actually actively oppressing somebody, and what practice is anti-oppressive, which is that, as Prospero Tedham says, it's the disruption of it, it's the changing of it, it's the doing something about, your idea of people standing with placards. I was one of those, young social workers standing with placards and stuff. And it's that's the anti-oppressive stuff, is what are we actually doing to bring about change here? What are we doing? And I think it's become so watered down that, yes, actively listening to somebody is a small part of being anti-oppressive, but on its own, it isn't anti-oppressive. And so I think the training and the teaching around anti-oppressive practice it's not varied enough. And in the same way that you were talking about listening to various different voices within a family and all of those having different views, in that same way, when we think about all of the different perspectives on social work and the different views there are on anti-oppressive practice, why is it predominantly only one way of looking at anti-oppressive practice that's being taught? Most people will talk about Neil Thompson's PCS analysis, which is really helpful, but it's the only one they can name. What about all the things like the I framework, or Prospero Tedham's 4D2P, or the 5 faces of oppression, or the matrix of domination? Or what about looking at more theories and models and ways of putting the anti-oppressive approach into practice? It's too limited. The teaching has become too watered down and too much from a single lens, I think. And I think that's really problematic.
Yeah. Just reflecting on that, Siobhan, I wonder if, because when I did my social work course, I was writing about anti-oppressive practice. And again, the students that come into placement with us, they're pretty much using the same authors and they're using the same narrative. And has the anti-oppressive practice changed the way that we see it now as well? And we spoke about, again, politics in the last session, and all those kind of different changes and narratives. Hasn't that changed how we see, and is that part of the problem, that we've got social workers that are confused in terms of what is anti-oppressive practice in the current climate that we work in? I wonder if that's part of the issue.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
But I think thinking as well about that politics angle as well, and I don't know much about this because now, of course, I'm living in in the North Island. But, in England, those local authorities where reform is in control of the local authority, their political agenda is very much against anti-oppressive practice. It's very much against equality. I think it's in their manifesto that on their first day that they will get rid of the Equality Act, for example. So, there's a huge issue there. And social workers are employed in the local authority that is then being managed by a party that doesn't believe in anti-oppressive practice. So that must have an impact as well. And I just think the current political climate generally, I've heard about all the flags being around. Flags means something quite different here. But when there are, here it is again about dividing communities. The use of flags here is all about dividing communities, but it's been around for much longer. But, flags being put up to divide communities and so on. And social work managers, when I'm meeting with them doing training, I'm saying things like, are you talking to your staff about how it feels to come into work and have to drive past flags or have to do this? And they're not talking about any of the issues that could be impacting on staff. And I just think, what's happening here? Are we frightened to talk about race? Are we concerned about looking at anti-oppressive practice? I think being curious, maybe sometimes being a bit clumsy around it, but being curious, being respectful, being supportive is a really important aspect of being an ally. And that's how I would see it. But I think there's so many conversations just not happening.
I think there is a lot of fear, isn't it, in terms from in the current climate. I think generally people don't know what they can and can't say, and I think for social workers, I think there's even more uncertainty. I think there's a lot of social workers that I speak to who are not sure what they can say in terms of anything in relation to politics. And I think that's something that's going to have a huge impact on how we view anti-oppressive practice in the future, depending on what happens politically as well. Siobhan, that you kind of alluded to, and absolutely the issue around flags and stuff. That's one example where some people are really unsure whether they can talk about that or whether they can mention that or not. I mean, we've kind of had a different approach purely because we've had a student that's been impacted by that on placement. So we've had to kind of change the timings of when she comes into work and things so that she can kind of avoid the school runs and stuff when there's a lot of general public out. And she's done a session actually for practice educators around her experience of that, which was really good to see. But I went to do a training session last week in an area where, as I drove in, there were a lot of flags. And when I noticed that the car park was nearly half a mile away from the venue itself, I went into a bit of a panic mode, thinking, am I going to be... And I actually rang the facilitator that was supporting the session to say, am I going to be okay walking from here? Do I need to be aware of anything? And they said, yeah, well, it was almost like, what's the problem? And when we kind of had this session, I was speaking about that actually. And the other participants were saying, we didn't even think that. What's the issue? And I explained that. And they said, wow, okay, we didn't realize that. Absolutely. I can see where you're coming from with that. So again, it's how, and it was a room full of social workers. And you think other social workers would have clocked onto that, but they hadn't. And they might be working with individuals that are going through similar things, and they're just not aware of that. So yeah, really interesting that. Because it becomes a norm as well, doesn't it? As well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the issues is that we've normalized so many things over time that are actually oppression. But we just see them as the norm now. So we're not challenging them, we're not disrupting them. Even just, the extent of poverty, because we see poverty every day, I think we fail to properly see it anymore because it's just there all of the time. So we're not challenging poverty in ways that when I first qualified, we would have been challenging. If someone had said to me when I was newly qualified, one of the things that you'll be doing as a social worker is assessing whether you can give little tickets to people so they can go to a food bank and get food. I'd be like, of course we'd never be involved in something like that. And now that's a kind of very standard social work. So I just think we're just, as society changes, we are just normalizing things. We're not seeing them as oppressive. We're not recognizing the oppression that we're surrounded by. There's so much of it. When we think about anti-Semitism, we don't hear anything from social work leadership about the way Jewish social workers are going to feel. going into work? Or how supported are people when issues are happening? How supported are, women social workers? Do they feel safe walking through areas? And, the misogyny that a lot of women face. And I think everything that's going on now about the manosphere and all of that is really concerning. There's so many issues, I think, happening for everybody. But really, are we recognising oppression, and are we challenging oppression, which is a core part of our social work identity? Or are we simply saying, I'm actively listening to the person, so I've been anti-oppressive, we get a big tick, and then, I've met that learning outcome. It feels like it's more like that than a true commitment to anti-oppressive practice. Just not seeing it in leadership at the moment, really.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think, Siobhan, I think it maybe has become a bit of a tick box exercise. And I think absolutely, I think when I did my social work course, there was much more of a emphasis on truly understanding what anti-oppressive practice is, and truly evidencing that as well when you went out on placement and things as well, to say, what have you done? That's in relation to anti-oppressive practice. And I've done a couple of midway meetings recently, and I've asked that very question. And students have struggled. They almost look at you as if to say, I don't understand what you're saying. Or to give an example which doesn't really relate to anti-oppressive practice. So I wonder if there's a completely different approach that we need to have on how we look at anti-oppressive practice, right from how we teach at university, and then how we kind of embed that in placement and with our ASYs or our NQSWs as well. But a lot to think about there.
I remember, I think it was with the old DIPSWA, the diploma in social work. I'm sure it was with DIPSWA. I mean, I've been assessing students against so many different social work qualifications because they've changed such a lot in my career, and then moving country, of course, and the standards are different. But then I am sure that under DIPSWA, students had to have evidence of challenging oppression, and there had to be an example of actively challenging. And I do remember sometimes it felt a bit forced, and there was, I've got to go in there and challenge something. And you could then talk to students about how we challenge. I love the new work that's been going on around whether we call it out or call it in. I love that. So as opposed to it being completely, actively challenging. But I remember students had to do something, and you had to demonstrate what you had done to challenge. And I can still remember it was almost like a project or something that you knew had to be done. And I remember some of those things that students did really having quite profound changes within the teams, and leading to profound changes within the teams. And even quite recently, a student that I worked with who wasn't required to do this, but inspired by Prospero Tedham's 4D2P model, she was looking at, I want to disrupt something during my placement. I want to be a disruptor because I want to be anti-oppressive. And she quietly disrupted. So she noticed in the team that she was in, lots of people talked about lack, children. Oh, we've got a lack review, or we've got lack, or I've got a lack, or so they would use that. And she would just disrupt it by saying, do you mean a looked after child? Do you mean a child who we care for? Do you mean and so she would just each time not say, you can't say that, but just each time say, do you mean? And it changed the team over time. During her placement, that team stopped talking about lack. And I think, maybe we should bring something like that back. A student is required in some way to disrupt something, because it can be about team culture. It can be about what's acceptable within teams. It can be about, sometimes we just get into things that are oppressive and we don't realize they're oppressive. So maybe we need to go back to that. Maybe that's my grumpy outcome, is let's go back to having a challenge that you have to do or something. I don't know.
Yeah, when I have supervision, Siobhan, my manager usually says to me, so Shoaib, what trouble have you been causing since we last met? Because that is, she knows I'm so passionate about social. She knows that I will speak up and I will cause trouble if I think something is right, or something needs to change, or something is equal. But she'll ask that question. And yeah, absolutely. I think maybe, and I try and do that with students in a more kind of subtle way. When students come on placement with us, one of the things I often say is the placement isn't just about you learning about cases, because that is not there's stuff that you can do with the case that allows you to develop your social identity. Also do a little project or something. Look at patterns in the team, look at the statistics and the data in your team, and then see what the gaps are and address that with the team. And I'm trying to get them to cause trouble and find those patterns. And many of them do. They will kind of pick up on issues and things that will allow them to do that. But yeah, I think it's a massive area. And how you kind of look at the whole thing around anti-oppressive practice is really interesting. But I was really keen for you to just kind of mention about the cards that you've got, because I've finally got them. And I've been testing them out a little bit, but it'd be really interesting to kind of for you to see why you kind of developed them and how we use them in practice as well.
Yeah, so I did the cards because, I'm sort of fairly well known for cards with the social work theory cards and the reflective cards. And I've always thought that there are three things that underpin everything that I want to do with students on placements. And they are supporting them with theory, supporting them with reflection, and supporting them around anti-oppressive practice. So I felt like I needed a set of anti-oppressive practice cards, but I worked with Prospera Tedham to do those. And so we put together, there are 62 different cards, and they cover lots of different concepts in anti-oppressive practice. So they cover things like models of anti-oppressive practice, like the I framework and the matrix of domination and 4D2P. But they also cover issues within anti-oppressive practice. So particular forms of oppression, for example, like anti-Semitism, like Islamophobia. They also cover concepts like adultification and microaggressions and microinvalidations. So that we've got these, topics that are covered in these 62 different cards. And each card kind of gives a bit of an overview of what does adultification mean and where does it come from, and examples. And then on the other side, there will be a reflective question that you might pose to yourself, or you might use within a team. And then there's also a how to take it further for learning. So like a learning suggestion, maybe watch this webinar, or maybe read this, or maybe think about this. So each one has both a learning suggestion and a reflective question on it. And we've done it like that. They're different to the other cards in style. Each of the sets of cards has a different style. But we did it like that so that, say, a student could get that set and really try and look at how can I broaden my understanding of anti-oppressive practice, and how can I bring in different theories and models and so on. So they could be used by individuals, but they could also be used within teams. And I think we said earlier, sometimes some of these conversations can be quite tricky and difficult to bring up, and they almost need a conversation starter. So you could take those into a team, and a team manager could bring in a few. Maybe they think there's a particular issue within their team they'd like to address, or there's something that they, maybe heard somebody using some language that they weren't comfortable about. So they want to challenge that through conversation. So you could bring particular cards, or they could be used in a variety of different ways in team meetings. As with all the card sets, there is a booklet in there that suggests here are some of the things that you can do with the cards. But I've noticed that I've tried to do a few things, because when you're designing them, you use them in different ways. And I tried to do one thing with a student that I just thought, this is silly. In the end, I realised it was silly, and why on earth did I ask this? But one of the things that I did was, I gave her the whole set of cards, and I said to her, pick out which ones you think are relevant in your placement and which ones aren't. And I think I thought she was going to, a bit like you said earlier, you went to this team and they said, oh no, we don't need to do that. I can remember years ago, going into teams, and they would say, we don't need to think about anti-racism because we're working in an all-white area or something, and you'd just be like, you just really feel, that'd be like my biggest grumpy thing. And I thought maybe something like that would come out of it. She'd say, oh, that's not relevant. And I could say, oh, here's why it is relevant. But she just said they were all right. She went through everyone and gave me an example of why every one of them was relevant. Now, she was a great student, so maybe it was that. But I think I didn't put that idea in the booklet, because I thought, well, actually, all of these 62 things are relevant in every social work environment. And I think that's the thing is, let's broaden our thinking and our understanding. I tell you what's fascinating is the social work theory cards, they've been around for years. People tend to know me for that. If they meet me, they'll say, oh, I've got your cards or something. People know the cards. These AOP cards have only been out a couple of months, and yet we've already got them being translated in several different countries. The other cards have never been picked up to be translated. So I think that's really interesting, is maybe this kind of desire to be anti-oppressive, expressing that we're anti-oppressive, but not actually doing it. Maybe that's a global thing. I don't know. But I just found that really interesting that, we've got them being translated into various different European languages, and that's not happened with the other cards. So there's something there, isn't there?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I wonder if it kind of goes back to our earlier conversation in terms of saying all the stuff around anti-oppressive practice is quite dated now. So seeing something fresh and new that's relevant for the current kind of environment they're working in, maybe that's why they're so popular. I think one kind of thought that I'd like to leave people with around anti-oppressive practice is research. So I've already kind of mentioned the importance of research in terms of that project work and gathering data and patterns and gaps. But I remember the first piece of research I did was around the local drug and alcohol service, because one of the things I noticed that on my caseload, which was predominantly South Asian Muslim, none of them were accessing the local drug and alcohol service. So I did a joint piece of research with the local service, and they didn't. Their caseload from that group, although we had a fairly high percentage of South Asian Muslims living in the community, were not accessing services. So when we looked at that, when we did the research, the data showed us a couple of things, but two things that kind of stuck out to me. One was there was no resource there in terms of bilingual, so everything was in English. And again, this was kind of looking back at a generation where maybe they didn't understand the need for drug and alcohol service, and or they didn't speak English, so we needed that. The other thing that came out from that piece of research was the drug and alcohol service was straight outside the taxi rank, so there was a lot of foot traffic. So one of the changes they made was that they changed their access to the building from the front to the side.
Right.
And suddenly you had more people accessing the service because you could go into the building without being noticed and come out without being noticed as well. And we developed a research which was in bilingual. But one of the things we talk to our students a lot about, and we're trying to encourage our teams, is when we have students, they tend to do a dissertation. And what I've noticed that most of the students will do a dissertation on something they've picked up in that service, which has really concerned them or really interested them. But usually it's a gap they've noticed as well. And that dissertation doesn't even go to that team or the manager. Sometimes the practice educator may know what it was about, but it gets submitted to the university, and that's the end of it. So what we're really encouraging our students to do now is when they complete the dissertation, that I see a copy of it, and then I take that back to that team and the manager to say, look at this dissertation. This is what the students picked up as they've been on placement with you. It's something you need to think about, and maybe we can turn it into a proper research project that next student can now work on. But yeah, I think those are little things we can do to kind of really work on that anti-oppressive practice kind of theme as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are really, really good ideas. I think doing the research is important, but also reading a lot. There is quite a bit of research out there that we can draw on and utilize in our practice as well. And again, so being research informed is always going to be important. Yeah. So actually, there was a lot of similarity in our views and our grumpiness about anti-oppressive practice. Maybe, I don't know if we should pose a question to listeners, or if we should just ask listeners to think about, in terms of anti-oppressive practice, what are you most grumpy about? There's a question we could just throw out there, isn't there?
Yeah. On an end note, Siobhan, I think one of the things I've noticed with this podcast is we've probably both been fairly contained with our discussion, and that grumpiness hasn't come out as much as within other podcasts. And I think, is it because you've had the opportunity to do the cards and the theory cards, the anti-oppressive cards, you really had time to kind of think about it and process it, and you've done something really productive at the end of it as well. And I think I said right at the beginning that I feel quite contained when I'm speaking about EOP, because I've had the opportunity to be involved in networks and projects that are looking at that and addressing that as well. So again, kind of going back to that, the importance of good supervision and good support network and peer networks and stuff as well.
Yeah. And the opportunity to talk to others. I think I probably talk to other people about my grumps around anti-oppressive practice more than any of my other grumpiness. So You're right. And maybe that's another reason the podcast can be helpful, is people can hear and join in with the conversations wherever they're listening to us. We hope you've enjoyed sharing this reflective space with us today. We are the Grumpy Social Workers, Siobhan McLean and Soyeb Aswat. Listen out for more episodes in the future, and don't forget to let us know what you're feeling grumpy about.